All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Living with Wildlife webinar. I'm Morgan Sussman. I'm one of DNR Fish and Wildlife's outreach specialists, and I'm going to be helping you guys with questions today. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you are welcome to drop them in the chat box. If you don't know where that is, it's just called Show Conversation. If you're on a computer, look in the top of the screen. And if you're on a cell phone, it's in the upper right-hand corner. So we're going to have some interactive components to the webinar today, so I recommend grabbing a piece of paper and something to write with. And then with me here today virtually is Jessica Merkling and Aaron Bassiger. They are both our urban biologists for DNR, and they can go ahead and introduce themselves and get started.
You want to go first, Jessica? Just introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jessica Merkling, and I'm the North Region Urban Wildlife Biologist.
Hi, I'm Aaron Bassiger. I'm the South Region Urban Biologist. And both of us together are going to talk to you today about urban wildlife and keeping interactions positive. So we're going to first start with the outline for the, okay. We're going to first talk about the outline, or go over the outline of what we're going to talk today. We're going to first talk about the Urban Wildlife Program, followed up with urbanization and wildlife, and then urban wildlife and habitat solutions, and then finish up with getting involved. So as Morgan mentioned, that this is a little bit interactive, so hopefully now if you've got your pen and paper available, we got a little pop quiz for you. We'll do this quiz now, but we're not going to tell you the answers, and then we'll go over it again at the end, and then hopefully see if you had any questions that this presentation helped answer for you. So real quick, I'll read them through, and then you just write the answer down. And like I said, we'll see this again. So the first question, wildlife conservation only happens in the country or rural areas, true or false? Not much wildlife lives in urban areas, true or false? Urbanization negatively impacts all wildlife species, true or false? Native plants and plantings are a better food source and provide shelter for urban wildlife than installing bird feeders or leaving out food and water, true or false? Native plants and plantings can help prevent an overabundance of geese in unwanted areas, true or false? Name a way you can help with wildlife conservation in your state and/or community. I found a baby animal and don't see the mom anywhere. Is it abandoned and I need to save it? True or false? What does the Division of Fish and Wildlife do with the funds from hunting and fish and license sales? The Division of Fish and Wildlife only develops habitat for game species. True or false? And then the last question, the Division of Fish and Wildlife will come out and remove wildlife. True or false? Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Urban Wildlife Program. So why is the urban program important? A lot of people think that wildlife conservation happens out there. And there's a lot of conservation efforts that do happen out there. Here you can see a picture from Eagle Marsh, which is one example of a great conservation group doing a lot of conservation work. So why is the urban program important? Urban areas are expanding. This means that out there is getting closer to here. In fact, there is a term urbanization, which is the spatial phenomenon by which town and cities are formed and become larger as more people begin living and working in central areas. Many people that care about wildlife live in urban areas. It is estimated that by 2050, 70% of people will live in urban areas, which is extremely important. So here you can, So here you can see a slide that shows, you're going to see 3 slides in a row here, but this one is the most furthest back. And so it's the recent changes in Fort Wayne. This is an area just west of I-69 with Illinois Road to the north, as you can see, and Covington Road to the south. This is just northwest of Fox Island County Park in Eagle Marsh Nature Preserve, about 12 to 15 minutes away. and that's 1998. So here we've fast forwarded 10 years. Here's a snapshot in 2008, and these red areas show areas of urbanization or increased sprawl of urban areas. And then we'll do, so this one's 2018, and we'll show the red circles again, which was the 2008, remember? But do you see any additional? Yes, there's the yellow. So the yellow show even additional. So as you can see, this is showing the last 20 years worth of urbanization in just one area in Fort Wayne. So here's a map of the entire state of Indiana and the land use categories. So as you can see, brown is for agriculture, green is for forest, red is for urban, yellow indicates pasture, and blues are for water. 96% of Indiana's land is privately owned, and Indiana is arguably one of the most altered states. Most agriculture in our state is corn and soybean. Pastures are often large monocultures of fescue. Cultivated areas are areas that tend to be stripped at least once a year, and urban areas are predominantly large sections of mowed grass. This means that conservation and restoration efforts need to be focused on private landowners. So what is urban conservation? Urban conservation is the examination of wildlife in areas influenced by the built environment and focuses on the relationship between humans and wildlife in the urban ecosystem. Oftentimes, urbanites are unaware that when altering the natural ecosystem, they create alternative habitats for a wide array of wildlife which take advantage of the newly structured habitat. This increases human-wildlife interactions, whether or not it's intentional. And so to address this, Division of Fish and Wildlife began the Urban Wildlife Program. Sorry, Jessica, there you go.
That's okay. So as you can see here, it's divided into two different urban biologists, the North region, which is myself, and then the South region, which is Erin. You can see that we have different counties highlighted. So for wildlife interactions, I have St. Joseph, Elkhart, and Allen County, and then Erin has Marion, Hendricks, and Hamilton and Johnson counties. So that's important for the wildlife component. But then you can see where we listed Elkhart, Fort Wayne, South Bend, and Indianapolis. So as you will see in just a second, I will explain part of our urban program. We do have funding available to qualifying projects for putting habitat in the ground. But some of the focuses of that money, it needs to be spent in the incorporated areas of Elkhart, Fort Wayne, South Bend, and Indianapolis. And it actually does include some of the smaller surrounding cities as well. And those are actually listed on the website there that you can see, which shows you not only Megan or Erin and I, but it also shows you the other district biologists. And it shows like the different cities such as Goshen, New Haven, Mishawaka, Noblesville, some of those other smaller cities that are included. So to address urbanization and the interactions with wildlife, the state of Indiana created the Urban Wildlife Program, and we operate under what we call the Urban Wildlife Pillars. Those pillars are wildlife conflict mitigation, promoting sustainable natural resource planning and development strategies, so things like sustainability and green infrastructure, developing, improving, and acquiring urban wildlife habitat, and then promoting conservation appreciation through things like education and outreach events or webinars. So one of the first things that we spend quite a bit of time on is wildlife conflict mitigation. A lot of times this does look like a phone call or an email where we answer questions for people that may have an interaction with the wildlife that may be positive or negative, and they want to either mitigate it or maybe change the interaction in some way, shape, or form. So with that, we answer a lot of phone calls. We do things like we work with Morgan and other communications to develop resources for the public to read information. We can provide guidance and prevention techniques. We do things like media interviews, interviews with newspapers, radios, those types of things. And then we also, the urban program itself is responsible for the waterfowl workshop every year. And this is the workshop that if someone is wanting to do Canada goose management techniques in the state of Indiana for hire, they come to that workshop and get trained properly to address those different Canada goose conflicts. The other thing we do is promoting sustainable natural resource planning and development. So this oftentimes kind of gets rolled into that developing, improving, and acquiring urban habitat. So things like encouraging and promoting conservation-friendly practices, or promoting things like green spaces and corridors for conservation or potentially recreation. And it helps facilitate that bigger idea of clean water, clean air, and healthy soils. So it's not intended to only benefit wildlife, but there is a human benefit as well. Sometimes that can even look like going to city meetings and having a conversation with maybe a park board or something along those lines that is looking for more information. And then again, it's doing things like workshops about how to properly use prescribed fire and other management techniques that are really beneficial to the environment. And then what we arguably spend most of our time doing is developing, improving, and acquiring urban wildlife habitat. These are just some examples of some projects that I happen to have pictures up my way. I just now this year is probably when a lot of my habitats would have taken off a little bit more. So it's not quite where they are, but these are all good indicators of really good beginnings. We also, as I mentioned, we do have a cost share program available that reimburses a portion of the cost incurred by a landowner for putting habitat in the ground. And those payments are based each year on habitat development rates. So we can help with things such as possibly pollinator habitat, potentially rain gardens and bioswales. Depending on the project and the different qualifications, that you could definitely reach out to either Aaron or I to discuss. If we can't fund you for our cost share program, there are other district biologists that potentially have cost share funding if you qualify as well. And if none of the biologists can help you, we do have other resources like Farm Bill biologists, soil and water conservation districts that we can point you to that direction if it works out that way. And then even if we can't provide funding, we are here as a technical service provider, so we can provide assistance for developing habitat, creating management plans, and typically for the urban program, a lot of that is for songbird habitat, pollinator habitat, and those types of things. And we do a lot of promoting conservation appreciation. We do work with a lot of partners for conservation appreciation days, potentially recruitment, retention, and reactivation activities, which trying to get people out to the hunting, trapping, and fishing activities. We also have a strong presence at the state fair when the state fair is happening. And we've also worked with other small organizations. The picture that Aaron showed you earlier was from Little River Wetlands Project. They host a monarch festival and an urban turtle festival. So that is something that I've participated in. So different things like that. And again, this is a free service we provide. So this is something that, for example, I've done a workshop in a community that was having an issue with Canada geese. So we had a discussion about different management techniques for that homeowners association. And then wherever possible, it's really important for us to try and combine pillars where we can. This is an example of a place down in Carmel, Indiana, where they were having issues with Canada goose conflicts. If you look at the picture of the sidewalk, you can see indicators of where they may have been having Canada goose issues. But they also had an issue with erosion on one of the banks. So they wanted to create a habitat to help mitigate those goose issues, create shoreline stabilization, and they also wanted a really pretty area for the residents to walk through. And so we were able to kind of combine all that for pollinator habitat, conflict mitigation with Canada geese. And then we also created a habitat where people really enjoyed spending time. So this was a project that occurred, it started 2016, and this is what it looked like in 2017. Then this is another type of how we combine our pillars. So these both show creating habitat and trying to instill conservation appreciation. So on the left here is actually a plot for Elkhart County Schools, where they have a 3-acre plot that is divided into smaller half-acre sections, where the students are actually going to plant these plots in middle school, and then each year they're going to follow that plot through high school to try and learn management techniques and things to watch for. And it ties into the Excel program that they have there with different farming practices and those types of things as well. And then the other one was a local high school that needed to do volunteering hours, and we worked with them to put native plants in the ground for landscaping. And we talked about how it helps to filter water and improve things like water runoff and removing non-source point pollution from our waterways. So it was a really good project that we really got students involved so they understand why we promote habitat and conservation. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Erin.
So I'm going to talk about urbanization and wildlife. So published literature has noted quite a few distinct behavioral differences of some wildlife found in urban settings. And here are the 5 the most noted that we've noted. Number 1 is movement and activity. Urban environments typically destroy existing conditions required for survival in a natural environment and creates an empty ecological niche. That in turn attracts species pre-adapted to specific conditions offered by the new niche. So this typically results in low mortality, favorable breeding habitat, and food sources. Favorable conditions may change the behavior and movements of some wildlife. For example, you could have potential resident geese in an area that has been urbanized that normally wasn't there before, but the habitat's been created. Number 2 is increased reproduction. More areas and materials are available for nesting. So a good example of this is some species that may use rooftops as nesting spaces. And a fantastic example would be peregrine falcons. They use buildings, bridges, and roadways. This also helps, warmer conditions in urban areas create longer nesting windows. And then urban areas provide access to anthropogenic food sources, or food from people. And number 3, the tolerance of humans. Some of the other factors have created attractions for wildlife, with some species learning to coexist with humans to reap the benefits, being rewards of food, which can result in increased reproduction. There was a study within a published paper that demonstrated that raccoon populations were higher in urban and suburban areas than in rural areas, which is kind of cool. Number 4 is diet and nutrition. This kind of circles back to the anthropogenic food source. Typically, these are new sources of food that are available which weren't traditionally there before. And then 5 is survival and mortality. Some species may result in an increase, some species of birds or raccoons, for example. Although there is an increase in some species, those increases can still be tricky in terms of survivalship based on new obstacles for wildlife. A good example of this, which was a few years ago, was, I don't know if everybody has seen it, there was a picture of a pumpkin Halloween basket. It was like a plastic basket that was stuck on a deer's face in Ohio. And so that's a good example of just a new obstacle that deer had never, been around, and so it got stuck and it didn't know how to get it off. Diseases can include things like salmonella, distemper, parasites, or mange. Toxins could be pesticides or heavy metals. Unsupervised pets can kill a lot of wildlife. Cats alone are a very big issue with wildlife mortality. And lastly, unnecessary human intervention. People perceive that they need to assist wildlife by feeding and or saving them, but that's false. They don't necessarily need that. So now we'll list some of the common urban wildlife myths. The first is that feeding wildlife is necessary, and this is false. This is not true and is oftentimes results in detrimental impacts to the wildlife. The second is that fledglings and fawns are injured or abandoned. Again, not true. most are holding tight and just waiting for mom to come back, or, you know, are trying to find their own way in the world. Maybe they're the teenagers that are trying to find their place. The third is that predators don't live or belong in urban settings. This is false again. Actually, predators in urban settings is really common. This lends to the idea that just because it's seen, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem and has to be removed. The next one is that all snakes are poisonous. Again, not true. Most snakes are actually non-venomous. We say venomous, and are extremely important to the ecosystem. And then the last one is misidentification of species results in rumors. So typically someone sees a hairless coyote that has mange and they think it's a chupacabra, or we have feral cats that, you know, run around and they see it and it could be a large cat, but they think it's a mountain lion. So those are some of the most common myths. As urbanization happens, we tend to see an increase in urban and wildlife interaction, which has created a demand for ways to deal with nuisance wildlife. Nuisance is a term we're trying to get away from. It kind of has a negative connotation. So we want to change negatives into positives. Be it right, wrong, or indifferent, we've created this need for people to address wildlife problems. Most agencies don't have the resources to address wildlife control issues. They provide guidance, which has created the need for wildlife control operators, or UCOs, or waterfowl control operators, WCOs. Biologists will not come and take care of the animal for you. And some people may not know how to deal with the issues themselves. Because a lot of the behaviors are food-centric, which is preventative, and or revolves around people trying to take care or save an animal, we're going to try to focus on tips and tricks to coexist and give you some food for thought on how to prevent rather than react.
And I just wanted to add the quick note on the end of this that these are all labeled as nuisance animals in the state of Indiana. And if they're causing damage or threatening to cause damage on a property, a landowner or lessee can remove that animal without a permit. The only thing that you don't see listed here is a mute swan, because that is also true of mute swans. There's a contingency on them though, because if it's a property like a lake association where multiple people own that property, or sometimes communities have purchased mute swans for decoration, then you would actually need a permit to remove those types of swans.
Thank you.
And so I'm going to talk to you about some urban wildlife and habitat solutions. So essentially Indiana's got something like 897 species of wildlife, so we have to try and figure out how to create room for it. But there's also ways to prevent conflicts and being more preventative than reactive, which usually is much more helpful in the long run. So one of these things, and we kind of talked about before, most people have good intentions when they feed wildlife, but sometimes even the good intentions can do a little bit of harm. So we want to try and encourage people to not only not intentionally feed them, but to also not accidentally feed them. When you feed wildlife, some common issues that may arise are you could potentially target non-target species. So maybe an animal that you were trying to target was being fed, but then you accidentally invited another animal that you didn't want in your yard. Another issue is habituation, as wildlife sometimes becomes dependent on food sources. If they become dependent, they can also become more aggressive when they're looking for food. And then that can also lead to a loss of fear of humans. So some of the techniques that we'll discuss later may not be as effective. And so that's one of the big issues with feeding wildlife. Another one is you can disrupt natural behaviors. And Aaron talked about that with resident Canada geese. Canada geese are supposed to migrate. They traditionally did. And that's not just Canada geese. Native Indiana wildlife is adapted to Indiana's weather conditions. So they do have a natural instincts to, put on fat stores in the winter to decrease their levels of activity. But if you put food out there for them and they don't have to go through that, then you may create a situation to where you're continuously possibly putting food out for them. And then maybe it's one of those crazy -40 winter days in Indiana, and then you don't want to put out food out for them again. And so now you create this weird situation where now they don't have a food resource and they didn't properly prepare for winter, and now they may be more exposed to the conditions. And then additionally, a lot of the food that people try to feed wildlife is not necessarily good food for wildlife, and it can create things like different diseases, corn-induced acidosis in deer, angel wing syndrome, and some of our waterfowl. So those can all be big issues. So we typically already know what it means to intentionally feed wildlife, but there's some ways to prevent accidental feeding as well, and that's what's shown here. So securing your garbage cans, not just a tight-fitting lid, but making sure it cannot be easily knocked over for that lid to potentially be manipulated and popped off. We would encourage people to feed their pets indoors, but if that cannot be done, once your pet is finished eating, you should clean up the food and water. We often talk about food resources attracting wildlife, but water can be an attractant as well. So trying to minimize that type of food out on your yard landscape. Cleaning up your grills could be a potential source of conflict. I'm sure many of you have had an animal build a nest in your grill, but I actually have a fairly large German Shepherd, and if you ever needed proof of a dog going after a grease trap in a grill, I could totally send you an image of that. But that's the type of things that may attract wildlife. If you have fruit trees or vegetable gardens, those types of things, obviously there's potentially other conflicts as well that come with those. But if fruit's already fallen on the ground, fruit is a really good resource for a lot of wildlife, especially in the late fall and other fallen veggies and fruits in the winter months. Those are really low-hanging fruit, if you will, and really easily accessible to wildlife. So cleaning that, having that be picked up can help. If you have poultry, it's really highly recommended that you keep them not free roaming and keep them secure in a pen that has a covered top. That would help prevent predation on them. And then finally, a lot of people do still like to feed birds. Not necessarily necessary, but people do enjoy it. So if you are going to have bird feeders, making sure they're properly maintained and that you constantly pick up spilled bird food, because as you've all probably witnessed, birds are not the most neat of eaters, and they can spill a lot, which may attract animals that you were not intending. Another thing you can do is to create habitat. So a lot of people put out foods trying to help wildlife, but we would like to point out that if you create habitat, habitat is the food, water, shelter, and space that animals need to thrive. So if you're providing good habitat, you're also creating the food sources, so they shouldn't need additional food on top of that. There are a lot of partnerships available that help you put habitat in the ground. We talked about the urban program and the Farm Bill biologists, but there's a lot of other organizations as well, and there might be a lot of local organizations that you can find. So some good examples are creating mineral stumps. This is something that was used for deer specifically. So if you had an area maybe that you need to thin out, potentially, for example, overgrown maple area, you can cut those stumps down. And so when you cut the stumps down, you've seen all that root mass is still below the surface, putting nutrients up into that tree that was there. So that new shoot is high in minerals and resources that are really good for deer. We talked about turf grass in that slide when we talked about Indiana land use. So turf grass is essentially a non-permeable membrane that helps facilitate carrying pollutants and things down to waterways. So it's just another surface that doesn't provide a lot of habitat. It has its place, and there's definitely good places to use turf grass, but in areas where it may not be in use, or maybe it's expensive to mow and fertilize and those types of things, maybe you can minimize your turf grass and plant native. That's something that you can definitely do. Additionally, if you have a habitat, using educational signage can go a long way. Sometimes it can be really hard to convince a neighborhood that planting native habitat is a good thing to do. Sometimes it doesn't always look like a manicured house, if you will. But if you try and educate others and let them know that, hey, It is being maintained. It's not just overgrowth, those types of things that can go a long way. Again, there's a lot of different partnerships. If we work with you on habitat, we do have signage for that. But there's things like Monarch Way Station, and the Wildlife Federation has a backyard habitat sign as well. You can also enhance your habitat by providing nesting spaces. So things like wood duck boxes, bat boxes, a lot of people are really into those pollinator boxes now too, which just create homes for wildlife. And again, when you do those things, it's really important to make sure that they're properly maintained. And you can get really fun and creative with those, because there's actually a lot of good resources and information that a lot of us have that we can forward to you. Things like extension offices have them, but they can talk about specific diameters and things like that, heights off the ground that some wildlife would need. So if you're trying to target a specific type of wildlife, there's ways to try and work with that. Tolerating messiness is a really good thing to do with habitat. A lot of people rush to mow their grass last thing right before snow hits, or raking up their leaves. But the things like down leaves can actually provide home to a lot of insects that animals will use in the winter. I know our box turtles use leaf litter and other debris to get through the winter. Things like snags, where they're safe to do so, so dead standing logs, as long as it's safe, they can provide good habitat and denning habitat for different wildlife. So those are all things that you can do. And then providing habitat is just one of the good things that you can do. It kind of goes with the minimizing turf grass, but if you plant, for example, like I said, in urban areas, pollinator habitat is pretty popular, but pollinator habitat provides foraging sites for insects, which is the basis of most of our food chains, and it can feed essentially a lot of the other wildlife. So that's a really good thing that you can do instead of just giving food. So it can be fun because each person can kind of find what works for them, and you can target different species. And then to keep interactions positive, there's some preventative things that you can do. Things like checking your homes for opening. That includes your chimneys, your deck spaces, holes around windows and doors and things like that. Animals can get in things as small as 1/4 of an inch, so keeping those maintained is a good thing to do. Do not handle wildlife. Observe it and enjoy it from a distance, but there's no need to necessarily handle it. Some wildlife is actually illegal to handle if you don't have proper permits in place. For people that may have ponds in their backyard, if they're worried about fish getting picked off, they can provide structure for fish to hide. If you have trees and limbs and things like that near your house, and you're worried about maybe raccoons or something along those lines getting in your attic, trim those branches back at least 10 feet. That's a really good thing to do to just kind of help mitigate the potential easy access. Covering your compost. If you think about some of the things you may put in your compost pile, it could potentially be a food attractant. So covering those to try and discourage wildlife from using that as a food source. And then at all times, no matter what species of pet you have and what size of pet you have, all pets when outdoors should be supervised. It keeps your pet supervised, and it keeps your wildlife safe. I've had a lot of calls both directions from either pets getting injured or wildlife getting injured, and just supervising your pets outside is just a really good way to help prevent that. If you need assistance with wildlife, as Erin already mentioned, the Division of Fish and Wildlife does not come out and physically remove wildlife. If you call us, we can provide guidance on what you can do for yourself, things like habitat management, laws, rules, and regulations. If we don't know the laws, rules, and regulations, we can work pretty closely with law enforcement to get you some answers. We can tell you harassment techniques, which we will cover a little bit later in this presentation. We could potentially help you identify a problem you're having. We could provide you information on the species, and we could, if necessary, refer you to animal control operators or wildlife rehabilitators. And a lot of people tend to call animal care and control. They are not there for wildlife. They're there for things like domesticated animals. Just like we are not here for domestic animals, we don't have jurisdiction over those, so we work with the wildlife. Another tip for keeping interactions positive is to ask yourself if you have a problem. Just because you saw wildlife, does that mean there's an actual problem? I do get a lot of calls that say, well, I saw, for example, a coyote run across the field. Well, Is that necessarily a problem, or did you just see a coyote running across the field? So other things to ask yourself, what is the behavior of the animal? Is it acting weird? Are you in the area of a den or near its young so that it might be defensive of that area? Is there a food source nearby, or is that animal eating? Is the animal injured? Those are all things to think about before you say an animal is acting horribly wrong. And then another important thing is, does the evidence match the accused animal? A lot of people like to accuse a lot of wildlife of various different things. Sometimes it's not always wild animals that are doing it, and sometimes it's not even animal related problems. Sometimes the habitat change. So those are all things to think about if you have an issue with wildlife. If you're thinking about keeping interactions positive, keep in mind there's various levels of responsiveness. You don't necessarily have to do the most extreme measure right away. This is from the Cook County Urban Coyote Research Project, and it just kind of shows you the proper responses on a different scale. So if you rarely see an animal at night, doesn't come around a lot, your proper response would probably be what you would do even if you didn't see the wildlife. So securing food sources, watching your pets, those types of things. But if you do get in a situation where maybe an animal is aggressively approaching people, it's not running off when threatened, those types of things, then obviously you can always increase your level of management if necessary. Any point in time, I think it's really important for people to be empowered of what they should do if they feel unsafe in a situation. These are all heavily related back to coyotes, but this is really important for all wildlife. So those are actually hazing and harassment techniques. You can make loud noises, throwing small objects, never food items. You can spray them with a water hose. At any point in any time, non-lethal hazing is approved without a permit. You can do things like making yourself appear larger, and if you're out and, for example, if you do see a coyote, keep your children and pets near you. Always give the animal space, and then fight back if absolutely necessary. I do have a lot of people that ask if it's okay to fight back. It is you're always allowed to defend yourself. What we don't want is we don't want to use these techniques if an animal is eating, if it's defending its young, or it's injured. And then keep in mind, you also don't want to go looking for trouble. Obviously, if you're out and about and an animal is approaching you, then that's one situation. But a lot of people get hurt with wildlife when they go to try and do something different. So good examples are a lot of people are worried about snakes biting them. Most of that occurs when people go to handle or kill a snake. So if you don't need to engage with the animal, then keeping a safe distance is probably a better option. And again, looking for ways that you can improve the habitat. Changing the habitat is likely going to be the best long-term solution for wildlife conflicts. So these are pretty much the exact opposite of things that you would do to create habitat. So if you are having an issue, maybe you don't want to keep creating habitat. But these are things that you can try. Planting a vegetation buffer around water to help mitigate Canada geese. Using native vegetation in your landscaping, it is adapted to our weather conditions and our local animals. Removing debris from your yard, like wood piles, which may arbor things like small mammals that may attract other wildlife. Using temporary fencing and or exclosures where necessary. You can use frightening techniques. Those can be audio, visual, or physical. Like I said, a garden hose, spraying something with a garden hose is really good. You can do that anytime. If it's a problem bird, you can carry an umbrella and bump it with the umbrella if it dives at you, those types of things. What we don't want is things like technically BB guns and paintball guns and those types of things. Again, if you have an animal that's in a snag that may be in your attic, you can remove those snags and perching areas. You can remove food sources. And anytime you do any of these types of interactions, you want to make sure you're following all of your local ordinances. And then you can always support hunting, fishing, and trapping. That is not everyone's cup of tea, and you don't necessarily have to do it yourself, but it is something that does help with excess numbers where it is safe and legal to do so. So your permit for removal should be your last resource. Obviously, there are definitely cases where it's needed, but keep in mind some of those other things we talked about before applying for a permit. And then for that, I'll give it back to Erin.
we're going to talk about ways you can get involved. So as I mentioned before, we want to keep interactions positive. So we want you to think, am I helping or am I hurting? Going along with preventative conflict, as a whole, we need to really stop and rethink what is considered as compassionate. Most animals do not need help. Animals rarely abandon their young. What appears to be abandoned wildlife may be a mom gathering food, telling kids to grow up or move on. Human scent does not discourage a mother from returning. Human scent is a myth. Mother will likely return when you go away. Just got to give it some time. Some general steps is the first question you should always be asking is it injured? If not, the best thing that you can do is to leave for an extended period of time. Give it, 2, 3, 4 hours, maybe even longer. Later, you can return to the nest or den or wherever you are. And more than likely, it'll either be gone because mom would come picked it up. So hopefully that's what you find. Leave it and don't hover. Most wildlife is timid of humans. They see us as predators, so they'll stay away longer if you're hovering around or in the area. Never compromise your personal safety. If you can't safely return to its den or wherever that is, just let it go. So we want, for the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Am I qualified to assist? Oftentimes, the best remedy is to leave it alone and let nature take its course. Intervening can result in prolonged suffering, which we don't want. It takes a lot of effort to be a wildlife rehabilitator. To be a licensed wildlife rehabilitator, you must possess a permit, pass a test, have a facility inspection, participate in continuing education hours, and follow specific requirements for individual species. If you need assistance, we can direct you to a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. If you are interested in becoming a rehabilitator, we can send you that information as well. If you ever need a rehabilitator, always coordinate with them before doing anything with the animal. Sometimes they may not have room, so they can't take the animal, or they could be anything that happens. If that happens, you may have to let nature take its course. Dead animals provide subsistence for other wildlife. It's all part of a bigger cycle, and unfortunately, not everything lives. So do I need a permit or a license? Most wildlife has regulations, as Jessica kind of spoke to a little bit earlier. There's seasons, size and possession limits, equipment restrictions, property restrictions. Removing wildlife is prohibited without a permit. Hunting, this could be a hunting, fishing, or trapping license, a special purpose education permit, a scientific purposes license, or a nuisance wild animal control permit. Proper identification is important for the protection of all species. And it's good to note that wildlife belongs to all the residents in Indiana. So how do I get involved? As Jessica mentioned, establish or create habitat on your property. Plant natives. Contact your local government, donate to or join a conservation organization, and buy a license, hunting, fishing, or trapping. Hunting license purchases help fund conservation in Indiana to benefit a variety of wildlife species and support wildlife habitats throughout the state. There's a Pittman-Robertson, which has a tax on firearms and ammunition. Those dollars go toward conservation efforts, with the taxes collected and then redistributed to the proportion of the states. And then the fishing side of things has the Dingell-Johnson Act, which does the exact same thing, but for sport fishing equipment. And so for every licensed dollar that you buy, we get a match from the federal side of things. So here's the resources. As Jessica mentioned, it's wildlife.in.gov. You can go here to find contact information for us, other biologists, solutions for contacts. You can find a rehabilitator, information on animals, habitat assistance, almost any information you can think of. I will provide a disclaimer. We are working on making this website more user-friendly and even better with more, great information. So just, work with us, if you will. And then here's the pop quiz again. So hopefully there's the questions again. I'll read through them real quickly. And hopefully you can see how you did. So wildlife conservation only happens in the country. or the rural areas? True or false? Not much wildlife lives in urban areas. True or false? Urbanization negatively impacts all wildlife species. True or false? Native plants and plantings are a better food source and provide shelter for urban wildlife than installing bird feeders or leaving out food and water. True or false? Native plants and plantings can help prevent an overabundance of geese in unwanted areas. True or false? Name a way you can help out with wildlife conservation in your state and or community. I found a baby animal and don't see the mom anywhere. It is abandoned and I need to save it. True or false? What does the Division of Fish and Wildlife do with the funds from hunting and fishing license sales? The Division of Fish and Wildlife only develops habitat for game species. True or false? And the Division of Fish and Wildlife will come out and remove wildlife. So we'll pop up the answers. Give you a little bit. So hopefully, how did everyone do? Hopefully everyone did better the second time around. Yeah. We hope you did, and we hope you learned. If you have any questions, again, feel free to ask. And then we want to thank you for joining us.
All right, you guys are more than welcome to go ahead and drop your questions in the chat box, or if you want to hop on with audio, you're welcome to do that as well. Okay, from Lexi. Any specific resources for creating healthy habitat?
Do you want to?
I don't know who wants we are like Erin already mentioned, we are working on our website, but currently we do have some habitat fact sheets on our website. It's the Division of Fish and Wildlife under landowner assistance. And then if you have a more specific question, definitely feel free to reach out to your district biologist and they can probably point you in a more specific direction if you have that in mind.
Just to add on to that, Jessica, we also just completed 2 building backyard habitat webinars, and I'll drop the link to where those are in here, but that'll give you kind of instructions on how to get started if that's something you're interested in. Krista asked, do you ever do presentations for groups, master naturalist classes, for example?
I can take that since you took the last one. Yeah, we do. We do presentations for master naturalists, any parks group, any sort of group. We've even done them for HOAs. If you're interested and you want to learn, just let us know and we'll make a presentation for you.
Yeah, definitely just following COVID guidelines, and then I think if Erin and I can't help you too far outside, Morgan may actually be able to point you in the direction of our education coordinator. I don't know if that.
Yeah. So we do have an education outreach specialist who also may be able to give you some resources, and I'm happy to give you her contact information if you're interested in that. I'll drop a link here to her different programs, and her contact information is on those pages. Any more questions, guys? You're welcome to drop them in the chat box or jump on. Lexi asked, are any of these webinars recorded? Yes, they are all recorded. And they're actually all on that link that I just posted in the chat box, and that's the on.in.gov/fishwilded. I'll also send an email out to all participants after that with that link. We'll probably get this one up probably about a week after. It's taking us a little bit to get it closed caption, but we do post them all there and let people know. Any other questions? Do you guys have any questions about certain species? Everyone's shy. I actually have a question if you guys would want to take it.
Sure.
So I live in a very suburban area, like less than a quarter-acre lot, and I just recently installed some native wildlife habitat. I put in some native plants, but over the summer I had an overabundance of rabbits that kind of came in and just they completely destroyed it. Do you guys have any recommendations for that? I mean, I want the wildlife to be there, but not to just kill it all.
Rabbits are a hard one because they're not considered a nuisance animal like some of our other ones. So for them to be legally taken, they actually have to be taken in the hunting or trapping season. So if you have excess rabbits that you need to remove, that actually requires a nuisance animal removal permit. Otherwise, I think fencing the most successful, but may not necessarily eliminate everything. If you do use fencing, they can jump higher than what I even expected, and I learned that the hard way. So I think the recommendation was a minimum of 2 feet. They can go a lot further than what people think. So the little small chicken wire gauge is what I've seen typically recommended, but just keep in mind going it a little taller than what you may think is necessary. And there's a good, Morgan, if you want it or if anyone else needs it, let me know. There's a good link to the wild animal prevention, conflict prevention website that I can send you that link to for more specific fencing information.
Okay. All right, so we got a couple more questions here. Oh, okay, somebody had a recommendation. So I used a liquid fence product to keep them out of my vegetable garden. I didn't know that was a thing. Lexi asked, are food plots for non-hunting purposes bad, such as clover plots?
You want to do that one?
Sure. No, they're not bad at all. I think it's one of those things that I think when you put something like that in, you might look at what's going on around you, around your property. If there's something that you can add that isn't already there, that's even better. So usually native plants and stuff like that. If you're surrounded by cornfield and soybeans, you've probably got kind of a food plot going on around your property already. But no, clover is great for a lot of wildlife, and it actually can benefit a lot of species. So it's always good to provide something like that, and that's better than putting out corn or bird seed or something that might attract.
And keep in mind, a lot of our native food plots are still native plants that are still good resources as well.
Yeah, the liquid fence product was something, I think it was like a urea or something, and it was designed for deer. but it also worked for the rabbits because I had more trouble with rabbits than deer in my vegetable garden.
So I do want to put the disclaimer out there that any of that type of stuff, I've definitely always heard mixed reviews. Some of the downsides of those application things is that once it rains, you do have to reapply. So those are all things just to keep in mind when you're addressing those types of products.
Okay, we got another question in the chat from Krista. So at my previous residence, my neighbor put poison out to get rid of skunks. Is that legal? I assume it is not. That was within city limits too.
It's hard to tell because I don't know what the specific one is, but the overall arching type of advice is you have to use it as it's marketed and you have to follow the label because that is what it is. So some people use one thing that may be a good example is mothballs and they kind of dump them everywhere. Very technically speaking, you need to follow the law by following what that label recommends. So that's the most safe option of whether or not it's legal.
Krista clarified, she's like, she put it on a paper plate mixed with tuna and peanut butter.
I don't know.
A lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've got another question in the chat. This one's kind of funny. What predator would decapitate a duck? The duck was on land, not in the water.
Could be a lot of different. I mean, you've got coyotes, you got foxes, you got raccoons. I had chickens and raccoons did that to my chickens, even other people. So there's all kinds of options. It's hard to tell.
And yeah, and without seeing it, a lot of times some of that is where they injure but do not eat. A lot of that can be linked back to domestic cats and dogs or feral cats. Either way, cats and dogs, so those pets.
Last call for questions. Jerry Ann, did you have a question? I can see you typing.
That'll be a good one. Oh, that's a good one.
Oh, okay, yeah. So Jerry Ann included our tip hotline in there. So if you suspect illegal activity, you should definitely get in contact with our conservation officers because they'll be able to kind of clarify if any like rules or regulations have been broken with that. So Kristen, that might be a decent resource for you for that one, especially since you're not sure what exactly the poison was that they used. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys all for jumping on here. We are going to send out an email after this and include a survey so you can tell us how you did or how we did. And if you have any recommendations for future webinars that you'd like us to cover, we have a wide variety of content experts here in the division that would be happy to provide more educational resources for you all. But thank you for attending, and thank you, Jessica and Era, for presenting.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Morgan.